So we spent quite a bit of time talking about cognitive biases, so confirmation bias, sunk cost bias, overconfidence bias, and groupthink. And we even spent a bit of time watching a video on the Ash experiment, which really speaks to our need to be to conform to a particular social norm. Maybe that's our crew or something like that. It's fine to identify the problems, but let's figure out some ways that we can actually mitigate that or eliminate or handle cognitive biases. I'm calling this antidotes to cognitive biases. One of the strategies you can use is to analyze progress against objectives. So we started out making some progress here, then we went 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Now we're only taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Let's reevaluate this and consider a change in tactics. So within the incident command system, for example, we have a strong adherence to objectives. They need to meet that SMART criteria. So when we're looking at objectives, they're not just nice to have, but they're actually something that we're either meeting or we're not. So it's pretty binary. If we are saying that we will have a particular building evacuated by 1400 hours, so building A evacuated by 1400 hours, well, when it's 1400 hours, we've either met that objective or we haven't. Now, of course, leading up to that, there needs to be a lot of status updates and evolution of how we get there between operations, say, and planning, for example, and logistics, obviously. But if we have strong objectives, those are our benchmarks. Those are our milestones. Those are the determinants whether we're winning or we're losing. So it's less about the cognitive biases, and it's literally binary. We're either meeting an objective or we aren't. Takes away all that emotion out of it. Now, another strategy to mitigate cognitive biases is what we call war game second or third order effects. So an example would be, I want to hear from our weather people and analysts. If we implement this plan, what's the most likely outcome? What about the most dangerous outcome? Okay, so we call this worst case scenario thinking, where we're optimists a lot of times. Remember this whole overconfidence bias? We're inherently highly supportive of our own plan. Go figure, right? Ego is not lacking in emergency services. A bit of a news flash there. But what we want to be able to do is worst case scenario this. What is the worst possible outcome? Because if we can kind of start to think about that, that will really open our minds and we can be a lot more subjective in our decision-making process. Okay? So let's figure out objectives and let's monitor and measure progress. Let's war game this thing. Let's war game it. What's worst case scenario? Let's talk to those experts. What does the worst look like? But of course, we don't want to be all doom and gloom, Debbie Downer. So we'll look at some good possibilities too. But let's not ignore the worst case scenario. We really want to challenge assumptions as well. Okay, let's not confuse enthusiasm with capability. What I just heard is that with any luck, we'll have it done by nightfall. Are you comfortable allowing hope to be the plan? I've heard this time and time and time again. An example might be, we've ordered some resources to show up at our scene. Well, I hope that they'll be on scene at 1500 hours, or they're supposed to be, or with any luck. Well, when I hear those terms or those phrases or those words within a briefing, I do the old, hey, let's pump the brakes on that. Can we change that hope or with any luck to definitely have that happen? So again, let's be very, very mindful for the assumptions that we're making, particularly in a groupthink conformity situation where we're making assumptions. That's a big, big problem. So now, let's talk about demand minority opinions. Dave, be our devil's advocate here. Devil Dave, maybe. Put yourself in the public's shoes. What are your thoughts? What are we missing? You can role play. All right? So, be empathetic. Put yourself in the shoes of your crew, in the public, in the stakeholders, whatever that might look like. Have somebody represent them and start to sharpshoot in a respectful way the decisions that we're making. tremendously valuable, and you're giving them permission to. Now, obviously, as I said, it needs to be respectful, it needs to be constructive, and it needs to be realistic, right? Because I get that, what about the meteorite that comes in and wipes out the EOC? That's a problem, right? Yeah, come on, pump the brakes on that one, and let's be realistic. But your job as a leader and decision maker is to make sure that other people are empowered to speak up as that minority, for example. Really, really important. Another one is the 80-20 rule. We're getting in the weeds here. Can't over-engineer this. Too much is going to change if we try and plan everything out. We have very capable division supervisors out there. Let's get them our intent, right? Leader's intent. I've talked a lot about that. That is the task, purpose, and end state. So the what we need to do, why we're doing it, and what does right ultimately look like. Okay, let's get them our intent and let them run with it. Really good example is in a larger scale situation where it's maybe not specific to a small geographic area, but something like a flood or a mass evacuation or a wildfire. There's a lot of pieces at work tactically out in the environment. Let's get to the 80% and let the very, very brilliant people, very, very capable people out in the field closest to what the enemy is, figure out that last 20%. Okay? Really, really important. Otherwise, we get into analysis paralysis. And we've talked about complicating factors. Uncertainty is one. Fluidity, complexity. All of those come into play. So it's virtually impossible to overprescribe, or it's actually possible to overprescribe, but tremendously ineffective to overprescribe what the tactics and what the resources out in the field should be doing. So let's get to the 80-20. Let's get to 80%. Leave the 20% up to the brilliant people out in the field. Here's another one. Validate perceptions. Let's not start making a plan based on a rumor. Where did you hear about the trucks being delayed? Let's get that verified before we start getting spun up. It's happened a lot of times, right? Where we're getting social media inputs. It's one person, maybe it's two. Does that necessarily mean it's an entire population? Or somebody to say, hey, by the way, boss, I've heard that there's an issue with blah, blah, blah. Well, hold on a second. Before we start changing everything here, let's figure out the facts, just the facts. Validate what those perceptions are, right? That's part of your situation awareness. Get good situation awareness, do a good size up, figure out what's BS and what's fact, and then you can start making your decisions based on that. So validate your perceptions. Trigger points is a phenomenally effective concept and technique. And what it is a predetermined act for a predetermined condition. Okay? So for the internet nerds out there, if this, then that. Okay? So if this happens, then that. So timeout, we got a fog alert. I think ops and logs are working off two different scripts. Let's have a quick huddle to make sure we're really on the same page here. Okay? So an example of a trigger point in real world would be if there's a fire that's advancing on a community, for example. Well, what we can do is we can establish a trigger point that if the fire reaches Highway 1, that we will now implement our evacuation strategy. Okay? And the advantage to a trigger point, there are a lot of them, but one of which is it is now a definite. So everybody on that incident, could be the public, responders, police, fire, EMS, public works, you name it, all know that when that fire reaches that road, they need to enact their particular part of the evacuation. And it's taken all the emotion right out of it. And what you can do is you come up with a trigger point ahead of time. So maybe it's based on the fire's rate of spread. It's based now also on how quickly people will be able to evacuate from a particular community. All sorts of things like that. You plan ahead of time and then you communicate the heck out of that trigger point. And when it happens, you don't have to say, okay, now police go ahead and do this. Public works, do that. Search and rescue, do this. Everybody already knows because you've established that trigger point and you've communicated the heck out of it. Okay? Trigger points, really, really important. Maybe it's if you don't have communications, it's a search and rescue mission, and we have teams out 8, 9, 10K away, for example, in a remote area where there's no repeaters or infrastructure. Maybe the trigger point is if you're out of radio comms for 15 minutes or a half hour, or whatever your number wants to be, then you automatically will come back in to the last spot you had radio coverage, for example. Okay? Trigger points, predetermined act for a predetermined condition. Tremendously valuable in the emergency response environment. Another one is tactical pause. It's a quick, often spontaneous. It can also be scheduled, maybe the top of the hour, maybe the bottom of every hour. It's a meeting to check in with key personnel. Now, it's not an in-depth sit rep. Okay? This is a quick, spontaneous check-in. How are you doing? So everyone, do tac pause, gather around real quick. How's everyone doing? Ops, how are you doing? Planning, good? Logistics, awesome. Or, Lieutenant, you okay there? Medic, you good? Whatever that looks like, it's a tac pause. And just remember, one of the most important things you can do in a tac pause is not actually the just quick check-in. Take a deep breath. And in fact, we'll talk about box breathing in other programs and other modules. Breathe in for 4. Hold it in for 4. Okay? Exhale for 4. And then continue going down through that cycle, box breathing. But if you can't do the 4 seconds for whatever reason, take a deep breath, maybe remove yourself from the situation. And one of the key tenets of TAC pauses, again, I can't speak strongly enough for the efficacy of these, is if you don't have time for a TAC pause, then you need a TAC pause. If you don't have time for a TAC pause, then you need a TAC pause. Because essentially what you're saying is if you don't have time, you got to really question, are you running the incident or is the incident running you? And if you don't have time for a TAC pause, the answer is pretty clear. That incident is running you.